Okay, yeah, let's go.
What was it like meeting Richard Feynman?
Well, it's funny because he was a childhood hero of mine, or maybe not childhood, but I was aware of him for multiple years before I went to college, and because of his books and his lectures, Feynman lectures on physics, and those had been recommended to me by some professors at the local university where I started taking courses when I was relatively young. And so I knew who he was. He wasn't as much a public figure as he is now, or a legendary figure. He was only known really to a small circle of people who were in physics, and he was known as a kind of, a great figure within the world of physics. But even then, like, particularly people in high energy physics tended to know, particle physics tended to know who he was. So, but I did choose my college based on, that one of the main factors that made me interested in going to Caltech was that he was a professor there. And so I first met him at freshman orientation. And in the old school days, this was fall of 1983. In those days, they took the entire freshman class, which is at that time was about 200 kids. They put us all on a boat, and they took us from a bus from Pasadena, which is where Caltech is, to probably the port of Los Angeles. I'm not sure where they picked us up. We got on a boat, and they took us to this little island called Catalina Island, which, if you're not from Southern California, maybe you've never heard of Catalina Island, but it's kind of an amazing place. And there's a camp, a summer camp that the school would rent out, and the entire freshman class slept in open air bungalows just right on the ocean on this little island, a remote part of this little island. And Feynman liked to come along. I guess he just liked freshmen. He liked students. So he would come, or at least he came to my freshman orientation. And so I first met him in person on the ferry ride, I believe, over to Catalina Island. And this is actually going somewhere, so sorry for the long story if nobody's interested. But he liked to sleep. We slept in open air bungalows, and he slept on the beach. He literally came with like a sleeping bag. That was the only thing he brought, and he slept on the beach. Believe it or not, even though I met him on the boat, people didn't connect that was Feynman sleeping on the beach. There's some old guy sleeping on the beach. And as a prank, I don't know so there were some big wooden rowboats, and we actually put a rowboat over him and trapped him under the rowboat in the middle of the night. And I don't think we realized it was Feynman. I think we were just pulling. Pranks are a big thing at Caltech. And so we just thought, and this is actually kind of a stupid prank, like, what's clever about that, right? But we did do it to him. And so what a very weird way to meet your hero, right? To like pull some stupid numbskull prank on him in the middle of the night. But that is the story.
If Feynman were alive today, what technology do you think he'd be most excited about or drawn towards?
Well, so he was one of the first people to think about quantum computing. And so if you actually look at the history of quantum computing, it actually goes back to some lectures that Feynman gave, a big part of it, I would say. And he interacted a lot with the other people who were the pioneers in quantum computing. And this would have been in the early 1980s, so actually around the time that I was there. I was actually disappointed because he wasn't teaching the traditional classes in particle physics and quantum mechanics that I was taking, or I wanted to take, at the time. He was teaching a weird class called Physical Limits to Computation. That was literally the title of the course. Physical Limits to Computation. And what that course was actually about in 1982, I think is when he first taught it. It was about quantum computing, because it was about what if you wanted to make the smallest, most fundamental components of that computer out of things we know about, like, say, electrons. But then you would have to deal with quantum mechanics, the actual full quantum mechanical properties of the electrons, not many electrons in aggregate, which is how our existing semiconductors work, but the individual properties of, say, a single spin on an electron. And so that is actually quantum computing. And at the time, I didn't see the point. And so I thought, why is Feynman working on this weird stuff? Why isn't he teaching the stuff that I want him to teach me? And I was actually disappointed. I remember talking to my dad on the phone about this, being disappointed. So he was a pioneer, had thought through a lot of aspects of quantum computing long ago. And so I think he would obviously be interested in what's happening right now in quantum computing, because we are nearing a threshold where it's starting to have some utility. Most of what you see on the internet about quantum computing is just hype. Okay, once you have venture capital flowing into this particular area, you're going to get a huge contamination of hype. Most of it is hype, but it is nearing a tipping point where it's going to start becoming useful in a certain way, which I can go into more later. But I want to say the other thing that Feynman would definitely be interested in is AI. And there's a very good but obscure lecture he gave at the Student Center at Caltech, I think also in the 80s, maybe early 90s or 80s. No, 80s definitely, because I think he died in 89. But it's about what he thinks about AI. And he had worked with a company called Thinking Machines, which was one of the first companies to build parallel processing supercomputers. So he knew quite a lot about classical, what we call classical computation, and had thought a lot about AI. And if you actually listen to that lecture, which was given, 40 years ago, he's pretty spot on. Like his intuitions are pretty good, like comparable to what you might hear from Jan LeCun or, various modern, quote, modern figures involved with neural nets and AI. Like I think he's not that far off base in his intuitions. So I think he would definitely be interested in what really is happening in these LLMs. How have they managed to instantiate representations of common sense human knowledge through this gradient descent optimization method? So he would be, I think, interested in all of that.
Just before we move on to China, Steve, say more about where we are in quantum computing. Are there any specific innovations we should be looking for? Obviously, Google's Willow chip, and then Microsoft came along with a chip. Is that all kind of hype? Just give us the reality of where the industry is today.
Okay, so the one fundamental question is, what is your scalable qubit going to be? Because at some point you're going to want machines that are able to control like a million qubits at a time. And what specific primitive object are you able to scale to the size where you could do that? And one candidate is the spin on some degree of freedom in an atom, for example. Another candidate is a much more complicated thing called like a superconducting flow of current, basically, which might have some more favorable properties. And it's still not resolved. What will the scaling qubit actually be? The Microsoft result is quite controversial, whether they've actually realized a topological qubit. And there are other people who advocate for things involving cold atoms or stuff like that as being scalable. It's still not fully resolved. Now, there's sort of two things. One is a fully controllable quantum computer with error correction, which can implement some of the algorithms. So there's a famous algorithm called Shor's algorithm. Shor was actually in the house at Caltech next to the house that I was in when he was an undergrad. He's about 10 years older than me, I think. So Shor developed an algorithm which is useful for cracking encryption codes, for finding prime factorization, or the discrete logarithm problem can be implemented much faster on a quantum computer. If that is realized, and that would take like a million qubits, if that is realized, it can potentially break the encryption that's currently used for almost everything today. That would have a huge impact. But I don't think we're close to that. We might be within, an optimist would say we're within 10 years of that or 20 years of that, but we're not close today. What we are close to is what Feynman's original vision was, which is that when you look at the evolution of a quantum system, if the quantum system has a large number of degrees of freedom, the dimensionality or the size of the Hilbert space, the space of potentialities of that system, is so huge that it cannot fit in any classical computer. It's just so big. It grows exponentially with the number of degrees of freedom involved. So if you want to simulate even something pretty simple, like a big molecule, like a molecule with many degrees of freedom, it's got, let's say, order 100 electrons and spins in the nucleus of each atom that interact a little bit with the electrons. If you want to study that whole system, its Hilbert space may already be beyond what we can do on a classical computer. But Feynman's point was that if you had a controllable quantum computer with maybe 1,000 qubits, you might be able to do a much better simulation of that quantum system. And that would have potentially applications in things like material science, like designing better materials or better molecular properties, or optimization in some high dimensional space. And so we are getting close to some useful applications. The people who will benefit most from the early quantum computers is scientists, not necessarily traders working in financial markets or code breakers. It will be scientists who want to study chemistry or material science or some sort of abstract optimization problem. So that's kind of where we are. But we are reaching a tipping point where I would have said investments looking backwards 10 years, pretty good chance all of that money was wasted in the sense that what was developed during that previous 10 years isn't going to capture the future core technologies that end up being used for the eventual big quantum computers. But investments now potentially have a chance of capturing stuff that's actually practically useful, capturing the IP rights over what is practically useful. So I think that's the nature of the inflection point, I would say. Is it was, to me, not investable 10 years ago, but it is potentially investable now.
You wrote a great article in The Spectator recently titled "The Frightening Advances of China's Military Capabilities." Would encourage everyone to go check it out. It was an excellent. I think people are still think of China today as the place where you go and you make cheap trinkets and toys. Just talk to me how China has climbed the tech tree and the innovation landscape in China today.
Yeah, so just to pimp my own podcast a little bit, I interviewed a guy called Patrick McGee who wrote a book called Apple in China. And within the microcosm of Apple and the iPhone, he really gives you deep insight as to how this all happened. So go back 30 years, you have a country which is very poor, has a huge low-cost labor force. They're so poor that only a few percent of kids can go to college. And so there's a huge pool of people who today have access to college education, but 30 years ago did not. Okay, so older people in China are not that well educated on average. Younger people are highly educated. So that transition is really the backdrop for the whole thing. Building that human capital and base, and also building up other infrastructure like their transportation system, the power grid, telecommunications, 5G. It's all there now. So they've invested systematically in all that infrastructure and the human infrastructure. And at the same time, you had Western companies going there initially for cheap labor, but because the labor itself was high human capital and because gradually they were building up their engineering expertise and such, they were able to understand and reverse engineer almost everything that came into their country to the point now where I would say they're of the US and Western countries in a lot of areas of manufacturing and particularly advanced manufacturing. So the momentum is all kind of on their side because they continue to produce huge numbers of scientists and engineers, outproducing the United States by a large margin and equivalent to the rest of the world combined. If you actually add up the numbers, like how many kids with a solid engineering undergraduate degree are produced, injected into the workforce every year in China versus the entire rest of the world. Those are actually comparable numbers. And so there's a lot of momentum on their side. Their infrastructure is very new, very up to date. And so this trend is likely to continue. The article I wrote was specifically about how that trend plays out in military technology. And for sure, they've largely caught up now in military technology and even surpassed the United States in certain areas. Serious development, let's put it that way.
Talk through those developments. Obviously, you have drones, you have robotics. Is it a case where those technologies, first of all, how does the US and China compare in those technologies right now today? And then second of all, do you think those are going to be the technologies that dominate the future of warfare? Obviously, we've seen what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, so Ukraine is a special case because neither side really has, until maybe just recently, has really what we would call sort of classical air superiority. So the Russian Air Forces, Russia, as probably listeners know, went through a very difficult time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they're only just now emerging from that. So their military actually declined quite a bit in strength and sophistication during that period, but they're sort of coming back. But they don't have really a first-class air force, and so they've not obtained the kind of air dominance over Ukraine, again, until recently maybe. Under the standard American doctrine, like when we fought the Iraq War, we first got complete air dominance, and then that constrained what the other side could do. So the Ukraine war evolved in a very specific way as a kind of war of attrition. The Ukrainians had built lines of defenses in the Donbass, and the Russians are still in the process of breaking through the last layers of that. So small drones play a very big role in Ukraine in a very innovative way. The interesting thing is almost all of the components for those drones originate in the Chinese supply chain. So, and in fact, the best off-the-shelf small drones that these guys can buy are DJI drones, which are DJI is a Chinese company. It's the dominant maker of small drones in the world, small commercial drones. So I think that's an area of concern. So if you're a U.S. planner and you think we might be involved in a conflict where there's just an incredible high use of small drones, as kind of in a way an intelligent artillery shell, right? The ability to like deliver a 5 kilogram blast to wherever you want, right? And very tough to defeat that little drone. That's sort of what you're seeing in Ukraine. U.S. would have to deal with the fact that we don't have anything like a supply chain for producing large numbers of those drones. Nothing that can compete with what the Chinese can currently produce. I actually think those small drones are a secondary consideration. One way to think of a drone is it's a cheap piece of plastic with rotors on it, but it has enough of a brain that it can do some stuff, or maybe you can remote control it, right? But imagine it's not a cheap small piece of plastic with little rotors that flies subsonically, way subsonically. Imagine that you actually have a full-blown missile with a similar brain. And in fact, onboard radar, onboard sensors, maybe satellite communications. That's really the state of the art for weaponry. And it's particularly important in the Western Pacific because the Pacific theater is so big. And the only plausible way that the U.S. can operate in that theater, for example, to reinforce Taiwan, is by operating carrier groups, by operating ships. And so the main question in that theater is, can the Chinese destroy those carrier groups from a range of thousands of miles away using modern missile technology, anti-ship ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, glide vehicles? They have a whole range of weapons they've developed, which nobody else has, which look very difficult to defeat. And one of the reasons, if you follow me on X, that you've seen me posting a lot following the Iran-Israel conflict is because that's a little bit of a microcosm of what we're going to see, I hope we don't see, but we could see in the Western Pacific. The Israeli side, backed up by the Americans, are using state-of-the-art missile defense systems. They are using state-of-the-art anti-missile interceptors, which are incredibly expensive and which the West can only make at a very slow rate, like of order hundreds per year of each model type. On the other hand, the Iranians have missiles which are definitely inferior to what the Chinese have. And the question is, how effective are these anti-missile systems against the Iranian ballistic missile strikes? And whatever performance level you see there, I think is going to be much less favorable to U.S. forces in the Western Pacific if there's ever a hot war there. So that's sort of in a nutshell what I wrote about in that article that you mentioned.
Yeah, it seems like in all of warfare, we're moving from this big, expensive, exquisite systems towards cheap, attributable systems. Of course, as you mentioned, China's manufacturing capabilities, and a core part of this new era of warfare, I guess, is just making a lot of stuff, right? And that's, if you read the book Freedom's Forge, it's one of the reasons why America won World War II. Just focusing on the US for a minute, there's tons of startups focusing on reindustrializing the US, making stuff again in America. I guess it's a broad brush, but do you think they'll succeed, or what's the key to succeeding?
Well, I think that a hypothetical America, okay, just to frame this, I'm older than you, and most of my youth was spent during the Cold War thinking about a possible hot war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so I grew up in the wake of Sputnik. There was a moment when the Soviets leaped ahead of the United States and put a satellite in orbit. And it was a shocking moment to most Americans. Most Americans could go out in their yard in the evening and see this thing, which had never been done before. See this little dot moving in the sky, a man-made object, which was beeping. If you had a shortwave radio, you could hear it actually beeping, right? Maybe you could even hear it on your AM radio. I don't know, but that shocked American society. So if you're a historian and you go back and say, what was the American reaction to Sputnik? You can find quotes from leading figures of the day, politicians, senators, generals, leading scientists literally saying, we have been humiliated We need to catch up. We are going to start an all of society effort to stay in the technological lead versus the Soviet Union. Those thoughts were articulated very, very precisely, explicitly from the leadership to the people to get the buy-in. It caused things like the creation of, as trivial as the creation of little model rocketry clubs in junior high schools all across America. More importantly, it caused the creation of most of the large STEM PhD programs in this country. So if you look at America pre-Sputnik, you go to your local state university, University of Indiana, University of Ohio State University, say, and you look at their graduate programs. They had some graduate programs, but they weren't very sophisticated. There were actually more sophisticated graduate programs, for example, in Europe at the time than just sort of random public university in the United States. But what happened post-Sputnik is money poured into these campuses, and the engineering buildings on these campuses, physics buildings, chemistry buildings, often date to that post-Sputnik era. That's when they were built. That's when the PhD programs were expanded in size by an order of magnitude. The number of faculty was expanded by an order of magnitude. That was an all-of-society reaction to the possibility that we might be outcompeted by a peer nation. There is nothing, literally nothing of that scale or seriousness happening in the United States today. Okay? So if we want to rebuild manufacturing in the United States, if we want to stay in the technological lead across a broad range of important technologies, we would need a reaction like that, of that kind. And there's nothing like that happening in the United States. I question whether we even have the institutional competence to try to roll something like that out right now. So if you ask me what I hope will happen, I hope the US will strengthen itself and thereby remain in a competitive state vis-a-vis China. What I predict will happen is that we won't. We won't get serious about it. We won't implement the programs that we need. We maybe can't allocate the monies that we need because we have this huge budget deficit that we have to fund, so that we have to pay the debt on. My prediction is we won't do it, but my hope is that we will do it.
So many questions there. Do you think it could be a case where those programs that kind of, hey, we need to do something here, guys, could actually come from the private sector? Where I'm going with this is, you mentioned Sputnik. I guess the 2025 version of Sputnik was DeepSeek. So I'm wondering, is it big tech as I go, hey, we need to do something here, or is that beyond their scope?
So on the narrow area of AI, we are actually reacting as if there were a Sputnik moment. Something like 1% of US GDP now is going into scaling AI, Gen AI, large language models. That exceeds what the US invests per year on basic research. So if you take basic research, biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, all of that combined, it's something like 0.75% of US GDP. And money being spent by these big tech oligopolies on scaling AI is of that scale. It exceeds that scale. And we are spending a lot there, and we are managing to keep ahead, at least somewhat ahead, of China in that particular area of AI. But everything else is in a totally different situation, whether it's molecular biology or genomics or material science or plasma physics or whatever it is. We're not actually staying ahead there. They have a first derivative like this, and our first derivative is kind of like this.
What's the next deep?
That's a good question. So I would argue we've already had a few DeepSeek moments since the first DeepSeek moment, if you broaden it out away from AI. So for example, the conflict between Pakistan and India was a DeepSeek moment because Pakistan effectively used military equipment from China and showed that it was as good or better in many respects than the Western equipment that India had purchased. So that was or should have been a DeepSeek moment. I think it was a DeepSeek moment for many mil-tech analysts, people who analyze defense. In AI proper, I'm not sure what it will be. In lots of areas, like, for example, operating systems. So Huawei has launched this thing called Harmony OS, which threatens to more or less replace Android and Windows in all of China, which is a pretty big economy. So I think you'll start to see things like this happen, which, again, like You wouldn't notice it if you don't pay attention. But Harmony OS might become broadly used in rest of world, like maybe not among US allies, but in the so-called third world or global south. You might find Android is getting outcompeted by Harmony OS, and Windows might be outcompeted by Harmony OS. Again, this might be 5 or 10 years from now, but very plausibly could happen. And that then causes a shift in the extent to which big tech in the United States has the financial resources to keep spending, the effectively 1% of GDP on hyperscaling. So all of these things interact in complicated ways.
Just say more about that, because you have a situation today where big tech companies will spend $300 billion on capex this year, yet you have DeepSeek and you have all these open source models coming out of China. At what point do those forces kind of meet? It's like the irresistible force and the immovable object almost. How do you see it playing out?
If you listen carefully to what Sam Altman and Dario Amodei are saying to the US government, like ban DeepSeek, right? Ban Chinese models, running Chinese software in your car, for autonomous driving, or just like the entertainment system in your car, like, is a national security threat, according to some people. So all of these things are trying to prove what are competitive, if not potentially superior products from invading our tech ecosystem. So they really are concerned about this. I would say among people who are working in the application layer of AI, so they're not developing foundation models, but they are using those foundation models as API calls or as some component of a larger engineered system. Many, many companies in that space, and I'm a co-founder of one of the companies in that space, are looking at whether or not we can substitute open source models like DeepSeek or from Qwen. Qwen is a series of models from Alibaba that are quite good. There's several different, DeepSeek is the best known, but there's several different, almost frontier level sets of open source models that have been released by Chinese companies. The application layer people are all looking at whether they can actually switch. And so that's a very threatening thing to OpenAI and Anthropic is if the switch is possible, then it threatens their core business model. And so one thing to watch is the extent to which that switch happens. Maybe they can get the US government to step in and stop that switch from happening, but that switch might still happen in AI applications that are shipped elsewhere in the world. So there's a very dynamic competitive landscape.
Say more about the work that you're doing at SuperFocus AI. What problem are you solving?
So a little bit of a backstory here that because I've known Sam Altman since before he became CEO of OpenAI. At the time when I got to know him, he was the president of Y Combinator. And so I knew several of the OpenAI founders pretty well in the early days before GPT became their primary focus. There was a period of time when they were doing other things mostly. And so I saw early GPT, so GPT-1, GPT-2. I even gave a talk at OpenAI something like 7 years ago, and there's a guy called Alec Radford who really, I think, single-handedly deserves maybe most of the credit for the early GPTs for really pushing them forward. Met and talked with him about it. So I was very aware of this hallucination problem, because when you train the model for next token prediction, it becomes good at generating plausible completions to the prompt. So they're plausible in the sense that they look like patterns that it has seen in its training data. But it's not really scrupulous about accuracy. So in other words, if you ask your model, is there a flight today from O'Hare to Charles de Gaulle in Paris that arrives around 4 p.m. local time? It has seen examples like that, so it might just say, yes, Air France flight 267 arrives at 3:57 p.m. Now, that might be totally wrong. It might have been something it saw in the training data a long time ago, and it likes that. So the internal weight structure of the model likes that answer because it's very plausible when compared to the corpus of training data, but it might not be factually accurate. And so that's basically the source of these hallucination problems that models have. So we've been quite interested at SuperFocus in trying to beat down the hallucination problem, methods for forcing the model to focus on a narrower corpus of base knowledge that it is told to assume is correct, and nothing that's only things that are in that base corpus uh, should be trusted as correct, and other things it should not speculate about or hallucinate about. So that's sort of like the core software platform that we've been building. And the most interesting recent application, we have deployed things in like customer service settings, but the one that we're most excited about right now is building an AI plush companion for your 2 to 6 year old child. And we are using small models with only a few billion parameters that can run locally on local hardware in those plush toys. So within a year, maybe roughly, you'll be able to buy a bunny rabbit or an owl or a bear that your little kid can carry around. And that thing will be able to have conversations with the child that delight the child, but also educate the child, maybe even teach a second language to the child, maybe work a little bit of math into the conversation, maybe work a little history or science into the conversation. That is now, for the first time, technologically possible, that you can run a local model on relatively inexpensive hardware, but it's good enough to delight a small child. And so that's the project that we're mainly focused on right now.
Fascinated by this idea of narrow specific models. I remember a couple of years ago, because the kind of common thesis that there will be one model to rule them all, right? OpenAI is going to build AGI and it will just do everything. And I remember that study a few years ago that Bloomberg built Bloomberg GPT, and then I think it was GPT-4 actually outperformed Bloomberg GPT on finance tasks. So just talk through the advantage of narrow models and how they are going to excel.
So it could be the case that a big model that lives in the cloud, a big model would have to live in the cloud, and then your toy would have to access it over Wi-Fi. That's one way to go, and that's technologically simpler, actually, because the amount of hardware you have to put in the toy is much more limited. You just need it to be able to connect to a Wi-Fi network. What we're trying to do is build the intelligence on device, and this is actually a whole trend, in robotics and Internet of Things in your house. And the insight that we had was the performance level of the small models through techniques like distillation and all kinds of quantization, all kinds of clever stuff, makes it good enough that it can fulfill certain narrow need requirements. One could be amuse and educate a small child. Okay. Another could be monitor your refrigerator, right? Or, so there's always going to be this trade-off between, yes, I could deploy a more powerful model in the cloud, but then I would need cloud access. And also, like the compute, you would pay for the compute in some data center, whereas if I sell you the toy with hardware on it, and that hardware is capable of doing the requisite compute to keep the kid happy, then you've already paid for the compute costs. I mean, you have to keep charging it up, but other than that, the compute is being done locally. So there's some advantages to that, and I think you're going to see a bifurcation where you see some stuff that's being done in the cloud, some stuff that's being done on device. Part of our software architecture is going to involve the small model, if the parents allow it, the small model talking to a big brother in the cloud to the big model might be saying, hey, I've analyzed these transcripts and this kid might be autistic. Maybe we should alert the parents or something, or this child is showing some psychological issues that we should, alert the parents. There could be things which involve this bigger model, which is not local, but most of the processing can be handled locally on the toy. And then maybe the only communications between the chipset on the toy and the parent's phone app via Bluetooth. And in that scenario, the parent can feel very comfortable that Sam Altman is not getting all the childhood conversation of their kid for years at a time. It's all stored kind of locally, and only bits of it maybe the parent allows to go up in the cloud to be analyzed or do things with. But there's just different value propositions depending on where you put the intelligence. And we think there will be a niche where people actually prefer to have the processing locally. And so we're kind of working on building the technologies around that.
There's a lot of talk about AI leading to huge breakthroughs in science. As someone who was in the weeds of both of these areas, what's the reality on the ground? Like, are we going to get AI to ingest every paper that's ever been written and then come up with these amazing breakthroughs no human has ever thought about, or is it a little bit more complicated?
So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So there are narrow breakthroughs using AIs, which they might be neural nets, but they're quite different from transformers to do things like model protein folding, for example, or other things. The AGI or ASI plan or vision that the big labs have is that their best model will incorporate all the scientific knowledge that is available in the literature and through specialized training samples that they're building. They're paying a lot of money to build these things. And that will create an ASI or AGI that's capable of independently doing scientific discovery, independently generating really good hypotheses, independently coming up with maybe whole new theories in science. Now, some people, like I think maybe the most prominent person who talks about this is Jan LeCun. Jan would say that's not going to happen unless there's an additional architectural innovation beyond transformers. And I actually kind of agree with Jan on this. So my experience when I use these models a lot in my own research, and you could ask, like, what's the difference between talking to one of these models about a frontier level problem in, say, theoretical physics and talking to a good PhD student or postdoc? Like, what's the delta right now? The main problem that I found with the models, and which I think you can actually trace back to the transformer architecture or aspects of the current architecture, is the inability to do what the AI researchers call test time learning. Okay, so I can do the following thing with any of the models, even the best ones like the O3 Deep Research or whatever the best OpenAI model is. I can do the following. I can point it to a body of work in the literature, open set of open research problems. But where I know the literature is incomplete and there's a lot of wrong stuff in the literature, and that's typically the case. If it's a frontier thing, things are not settled. And so the distribution of things that are even in the published peer-reviewed literature, there's a lot of wrong stuff. I can point the model in that direction and it will typically then give me back, it will regurgitate something which is more or less an amalgam of like what it sees in the training or search results in the literature. But then with a grad student, I might get the same thing. I send the grad student away for a week or a month to like do the same research and come back to my office and we'll talk about it. With the grad student, I can immediately like start doing stuff on the whiteboard where I say, okay, this set of papers, they have a problem because of this assumption, or the way they calculated this is, incomplete, or it's a bad approximation of this regime. And I can update the grad student in that test time update. So if for a model, you would call this test time interaction with the model, because you're not changing its weights, you're not retraining it, you're interacting with it. I can profitably, effectively realign the grad student's thinking so that the insights that I give it at test time, that grad student will then largely, if it's a good grad student, will largely incorporate in further work that he or she does in this direction. The model will not do that. The model, you can realign them a little bit, but they tend to always default back to the crap they've seen in the training data. And so AI researchers would call this lack of ability to do test time learning. I could even give it like logically very tight arguments for why what it gave me as a response previously is just totally wrong. But even that completely logically tight criticism of what it gave me eventually will be overcome by what's in the weights, what's in its training weights, and what it saw earlier. I think, again, this is an insight that I think people who have never done frontier research in a hardcore science, maybe don't quite appreciate this. They just see, oh, the model is so smart, it answers all my questions, and it can score really high on this test, and so it must be as good as a PhD scientist. But this is a very, very fundamental limitation to the models, and the way to solve that actually involves probably some architectural innovations, not just more scaling. Okay, and I think this is actually among the more insightful AI researchers is pretty well acknowledged that this is an issue. But if you even go one step away, like you talk to people who lead the labs, the big AI labs, who maybe themselves have never been frontier level researchers in any field, they don't quite get this. And so a lot of them, especially like even people who are like, say I'm an quote AI engineer and I'm really good at the programming CUDA or programming in Python or doing things that are relevant to the training process, the scaling process or testing process of models. Nevertheless, that individual might not have ever been a frontier researcher in a real like frontier area of science. They may not appreciate this point. And so a lot of them are making this kind of very naive extrapolation that like, yeah, all of a sudden these things are going to be better than human scientists at doing real science. And I think it's more complicated than that.
Dave, there's so many more questions I have for you about so many more topics, genomics, everything. I know we're coming up on time, and I want to be mindful of your time. Maybe we can finish with a quick game, a Tyler Cowen game, inspired game of overrated, underrated. So I'm going to name a dozen technologies, and you just give me one word: overrated or underrated. Sound good?
Okay.
LLMs.
Properly rated.
Humanoid robots.
Overrated.
CRISPR.
Overrated.
mRNA.
I don't know enough to say. I would say probably properly rated.
Embryo selection.
Underrated.
Nanotechnology.
I want to include in nanotechnology semiconductor physics because it is in fact, maybe one can even argue, the only area of nanotechnology that actually works. But if you include that, then I would say underrated. So Tyler himself used to complain a lot about lack of progress, but then he doesn't factor in like a factor of a million we got from nanotechnology and semiconductor physics. So anyway, underrated.
Flying cars.
I'd say properly weighted.
Batteries.
Underrated.
Quantum computing.
Wow, so tough
Hey, good.
because there's so much hype. I don't know whether I should index more on the hype from the grifters in the industry or like there are a lot of skeptics in academia. I would say the answer's too multidimensional to answer that one.
AI tutors.
Underrated.
Brain-computer interfaces.
Invasive, I think, is overrated in the short run. Possibly it'll work in the longer run. But I think non-invasive brain-computer interfaces have a lot of potential that's underrated.
Drones.
Wow. Probably still underrated.
Steve Shue.
I want to say...
Go ahead, sorry.
I want to say drones here are, in a sense, just a form of robotics. But the form factor is different. It's not a humanoid form factor, but it's just a quadcopter or whatever form factor. I think that there's still a lot of applications that we're going to see that people are not factoring in yet.
Steve, thank you so much for your time. Maybe I'll see you in Michigan next week.
Yeah, my pleasure.